Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi and welcome to the ISO Show. Are you looking for a sustainability roadmap for your business? And are you looking to address the climate emergency, but to also meet your stakeholders' needs both now and in the future? Then you're in the right place. Over the last 2 episodes, Carbonologist David Algar and I have been going through ISO 14064, the carbon verification standard, and PAS 2060, the carbon neutrality standard. And today, David and I will be explaining how you can meet the requirements of both of these standards, gain verification and demonstrate your business is carbon neutral. And that's all going to be based on our game-changing route to sustainability, which is called Carbonology. So what makes Carbonology unique? Well, rather than paying lip service to the climate emergency, Carbonology provides a proven methodology for sustainable success. And that's because it's underpinned by the leading global carbon standards, which we've just been discussing in the previous episodes. So Carbonology provides a wealth of experience of helping businesses, together with our innovative thought leadership in assisting businesses to be carbon neutral and also to achieve ISO standards successfully. As part of your sustainability roadmap, Carbonology gives the option to demonstrate credibility and confidence against these standards that it's fundamentally based upon. And just as a reminder, if you haven't listened to the previous 2 podcasts, which I'd strongly recommend that you do go back and listen to them, that's the Carbon Verification Standard ISO 14064 and the Carbon Neutrality Standard PAS 2060. And as we've mentioned in the previous podcasts, the standards, you don't get certification to the standards with a certification body, it's verification. And we have been through the different methods, which include self-verification, the second-party verification, and also third-party verification. So please do go back and check out the previous 2 podcasts, and you can also get information in the show notes as well on the 2 standards. Now, I am joined by David, who is our carbonologist. So hi David, welcome back again.
Hi Mel, thanks for having me again.
Great. Now, I'm going to take our ISO Show listeners through the 7 stages in Carbonology, just as an overview, so they've got a flavour of that. But I am going to be leaning on your support as our expert in terms of how we actually meet the requirements of both of those standards by using those 7 steps. So that's what we'll do. So just to kick off then, I'll just kind of give a bit of an overview on what those 7 steps are. And again, don't forget, you can get your free information in the show notes on the Carbonology methodology. So the first thing that we do is define. So that's the first stage. Define the scope and boundaries. So you need to define what's to be included and for which period. Okay, so that's typically for a 12-month period. Okay, but that's something that David will expand on. And you need to determine the different emission scope types. You also need to look at the leadership commitment as well to becoming carbon neutral. Okay, so that's the first stage, which is define. The second stage is to quantify. So from the data that you've provided, we can then apply the verification criteria. We then calculate and quantify your carbon footprint, and we need to look at the upstream and downstream scopes for 1, 2 and 3 emissions. Now, David did expand on this in one of the previous podcasts, but he will go into a bit more detail on that very shortly. The next stage, the third stage, is commit. So you need to have some kind of commitment to becoming carbon neutral. And the requirement of one of the standards says that you need to have a carbon footprint management plan. So by developing that carbon management plan, you can include recommendations for emission reductions and also your commitment to reducing your energy and carbon emissions. Okay, because ultimately this is your sustainability roadmap to achieving carbon neutrality. And this is a document that is being requested in tenders and also by other shareholders and stakeholders that you may have that you need to demonstrate what you're actually doing in terms of your commitment to the environment. The next stage, the fourth stage, is to reduce. So now that you've understood what your carbon footprint is, the next natural stage is to look at ways to be able to reduce it. So you would already set out in your carbon management plan ways to reduce your carbon footprint, and this is where you need to put that into action. So you need to implement the carbon reductions and also have mechanisms to be able to monitor and report on that impact. And of course you need to communicate that internally and externally where applicable. Okay, so this is where it could potentially dovetail into your existing environmental management system or energy management system, because in theory you should already have a mechanism for looking at what your carbon footprint is, but also you might have operational controls within the business that you can enhance as a result of this carbon management plan. So the next step, the fifth step, is to re-quantify your data. So going back a step to the quantification that you did in the second step, you should in theory have a reduction in your overall carbon emissions. So why is that important? Well, A, you want to be able to demonstrate that you're serious about reducing your carbon footprint, and you've actually done it. You've actually reduced your carbon emissions. But what that basically means is it leaves this residual GHG emissions for you to then to be able to offset. And of course, from a financial perspective, it's going to be less expensive to offset your carbon if you've reduced your carbon emissions. Okay, so you want to reduce your carbon emissions as much as you possibly can do and then offset the residual, what's left. So the sixth stage is the offsetting. Okay, so this is where we can help you to select carbon offsetting scheme. So we don't do the carbon offsetting for you. We're not an offsetting company, but we can recommend some credible schemes, and of course you're free to choose whichever scheme you wish. You would then engage in their services and offset your carbon, and they will then provide you with some type of evidence of proof. So generally that's a certificate of offsetting. So that's your proof that you have actually offset your carbon footprint. But the next and the final stage, which is the seventh stage in Carbonology, is that final declaration. So it's really important that you do issue a declaration statement for that defined period that you established within the scope and boundaries, and that you have some type of formal verification statement. Okay, so this is a statement that you're confirming that you have actually become carbon neutral for that period. As we've talked about in the other couple of podcasts, you have got options to either do a self-verification, a second-party verification, which would be an audit against the requirements of the standards, and then finally a third-party verification, which could be with a certification body that has the resources and has the approval to provide you with a third-party audit, which we can then issue with a verification statement. So that's an overview of the 7 stages in Carbonology. So just to summarise what those stages are then, we've got define, quantify, commit, reduce, re-quantify, offset, and then declare. Okay, now obviously I've just kind of gone through that quite briefly, and I'm sure that you've got some other questions to ask. So what I'm going to do is now invite David to expand on some of those areas. So welcome back, David.
Hi, Mel.
Hi. Yeah, so thanks very much for joining us today to go into a little bit more detail on some of these areas. So let's kick off with the first step, the define stage. Could you just expand on that for us in a bit more detail, please, David?
Yes, so step 1, define. This is where you would decide upon your subject. So this is using the terminology in PAS 2060. So you have to decide the subject that you're going to make carbon neutral. So this can be your entire business, it can be a section of it can be a specific site, or just any part of your business really. In this first part of the Carbonology steps to success, you will also have to define the rationale for the selection. So why did you choose this? So not only why did you choose this as a subject, but why did you exclude anything or any parts of it? So one of the key outputs of Carbonology, or one of the key documents that you'll produce, is the Qualifying Environmental Statement, or QES, which is specified in PAS 2060. So within this, and in the beginning of the QES, you will define the individual responsible for providing necessary data, description of the subject and its functions, so essentially what your business does, so what do you sell, what do you make, what services do you provide, and then specific activities that you need to fulfill that function. So for instance, operating an office or a delivery fleet. So you'll have to describe, like I said, what your business does and its functions. You will also define the boundaries of the subject, as with PASS 2060. So as I previously mentioned, you'll need to define what you're including to make carbon neutral and make that very clear. And again, the rationale for that, you really do have to be transparent with any exclusions. And here you will also define specific Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emission sources that you will be quantifying and defining. So for those who aren't familiar, Scope 1 are your direct emission sources. So this will be stationary and mobile combustion of greenhouse gases, for instance, if you burn gas on site, if you burn any chemicals in a flue, or if you operate a fleet of vehicles that you directly own yourself and have financial control over. Scope 2 is generally a bit more simple, which is your purchased energy. So that's generally slightly easier to define. And then Scope 3 emission sources, which I think we'll go into more detail on later on. It gets a bit more complicated here as you have the upstream and downstream indirect emission sources. As Mel mentioned, at this stage you will also establish leadership commitment. So you'll need to establish responsibilities, who does what, and the allocation of resources. So yes, at this point you really do need to define that leadership commitment, because success largely depends on the decision makers within your organisation.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much then, David. Then moving on to number 2, and for me personally this is kind of the scary part, which is the quantification part. So can you just kind of dive into the number crunching stage, please, David?
Yes, so this is the number crunching stage. It can sound a bit daunting, but with a lot of the templates that are available on the internet and that Blackmores have created, it's not too difficult, depending on the organisation. So as I mentioned, this is where we quantify emission sources for Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So this is essentially a big list of your emission sources, so specific things such as vehicles, mileage, energy, embedded emissions within products you sell, and then converted into tons of CO2 equivalent. So essentially the end figure we want to get to here is how much emissions do you produce in equivalent tons of CO2. So to get this, we multiply metrics. For instance, we take mileage for a specific vehicle or kilowatt hours from a specific office, and we multiply that by an appropriate conversion factor. Also, it's worth noting at this point, you're probably going to be questioned on these conversion factors, depending on which sorts of certification you decide to go for later down on the line. So it is also very useful to justify and document any choices you make, because you probably will be questioned on it. So, like I said, it's very important to record your methodologies, because you may be asked, why did you choose a specific conversion factor? For instance, why did you choose to apply the conversion factor for medium vehicles to your fleet? Or why did you not choose large vehicles? At this point, you will also address any uncertainties as to not underestimate emissions. Of course, uncertainties are part of life, and sometimes you do have to make estimates. Sometimes the data is not always there. Sometimes the data itself is not perfect. It's perfectly okay to make an estimate based on sound logic. You would just have to record your methodologies for this and any reasons you choose to go down one route rather than another.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. And I think what I'd like to do is just kind of touch on the fact here that you've referenced recording, justifying, documenting the methodologies used. And obviously we've taken the pain out of that by actually creating Carbonology. In fact, that's why it got the name Carbonology, because it is based on the fact that you do have to be able to identify, record, justify, document your methodology every step of the way. Which I think it's only right that should be the case in order to be able to demonstrate that you are seriously committed to becoming carbon neutral.
Yes.
Okay, so talking about commitment, that brings us quite nicely onto our next stage, which is stage 3, the commit stage. So let's explore this in a bit more detail.
Yes, so the key output of the last stage is your greenhouse gas inventory. So following on from the results of that in this stage, commit stage 3, you'll produce a carbon footprint management plan based on the outputs of your greenhouse gas inventory. So this is a set of specific initiatives and targets to reduce your carbon footprint. And it's also important to remember at this stage, the better our targets and the more reductions we make, the cheaper the offsetting will be. But we'll get to that in a moment. So examples, very specific examples you could include in your carbon footprint management plan include sort of well-known things, including switching to LED lighting to reduce your energy usage or better office installation if you're in a slightly older building. Or one of the more contemporary ones is switching to an electric vehicle fleet if you can. So here in the Carbon Footprint Management Plan, we will also develop a commitment to reduction and carbon neutrality. Also, another important thing to consider is businesses change, as we know with COVID. Obviously, one of your key objectives as a business is going to be expand in terms of profit, hopefully. So at this point, we use intensity targets as well as absolute targets. So in case you haven't heard of this term before, intensity targets take into account business expansion. So you could set a target for your tons of CO2 relative to your turnover, or as we did with a client recently, relative to their members of staff. But that could be other things, including the size of a site, for instance, kilowatt hours used per metre squared of a site.
Okay, that's a great explanation, because I think that some organisations think, well, if I'm going to be carbon neutral, I can't use any more energy. When actually businesses are growing all the time, they might develop new product services, get additional locations, and so it's definitely not going to prevent growth of business, because obviously all businesses need to be profitable and to be productive, but it does obviously help us to look at making best use of our energy consumption and to optimise energy efficiency. And I think one of the things that we are coming across here is a lot of people working from home during COVID. So it's interesting how you mentioned about looking at targets based on number of staff, because obviously that you need to take that into consideration as well. So would you be including aspects of that in terms of home working within that carbon footprint management plan?
Yes, definitely. We do include working from home as scope 3. Some people argue it should be a scope 4 on its own now, but at the moment it's classed as scope 3. Yes, so we do have figures we use to estimate that. Ideally, we'd use the number of recorded days of working from home, and then we'd account for the additional energy usage. So if you are working from home, obviously you'll be using your own electricity, heating, lighting, you'll be running a laptop, monitor, phone, etc. So we'd have to count that as scope 3 emissions.
I think that's another podcast in the making, David. We'll explore that in further detail, because I know that this is a hot topic for a lot of businesses right now when they're dealing with the calculations and they're wondering how to tackle home workers as part of that.
Yes.
Okay, so moving on to the next stage for reduce. So I know that I mentioned in a previous podcast that, if a business already has 14,001 or 50,001, in theory they have got that structure in place, but some businesses don't. So could you just kind of share with us what they need to do in terms of reducing their carbon footprint?
Yes, so this is where we start to implement the management plan. It's very important to have a reliable way to monitor your reductions and data collection. As you said, many companies will have this in place, but if you don't, by this point you probably would have spoken to your landlord and facilities management at some point and started to make a relationship with them in order to collect the relevant data. So it's very important to have that available. Typically this reduction period will last 12 months, with your first reporting period acting as a baseline against future reductions. And another part of this stage, of the reduction stage, is you will start to create a communications plan for success. So this will both be reporting on progress, so the positive stuff, and celebrating success to your stakeholders and staff. And this will also help update staff on progress and what they can do to help with reductions.
Yeah, because everybody plays a part, don't they? It's not just going to be one person that's responsible for a carbon footprint management plan delivery and implementation. I think it's important that it's been communicated, throughout the organisation, and everybody realises that they can actually all make a difference individually, as well as, the entire organisation.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, so moving on to step 5, re-quantify. So this almost seems like going back to basics, David. If we've already done the quantification, could you just expand on the benefits of doing this re-quantification and how that works?
Yes, so this is how we see how effective our carbon footprint management plan is. It also allows us to demonstrate our commitment to reduction. So if there are actual results out there that show we've done X and it's produced Y, then it gives us an indication of how well we're doing. Another important part of this and Carbonology is it also gives us an indication of how much offsetting needs to be done. So once we've re-quantified, it will give us another figure, hopefully lower, it will be lower, which then shows how much offsetting we need to do. This requantification also allows for comparisons to be made against each reporting period.
Yeah, that's great. I think in terms of, providing reports to the board and to, shareholders, stakeholders, then this is really useful data, isn't it, to be able to demonstrate the progress within the organisation. And one of the things that businesses may miss out on if they don't do this requantification and apply the reductions and they just go straight to the offsetting, they're kind of missing a trick, aren't they? Not just financially, but from an environmental perspective. So I can see that, there's quite a lot of offerings around being carbon neutral, but a lot of them do miss out on these two stages, which I think is really important to demonstrate your commitment to, to taking this seriously and not just paying a fee to offset and to say that you're carbon neutral.
Of course, yeah, with ISO 14064 and PAS 2060 combined do help a business make a genuine positive environmental impact.
Okay, so moving on to stage 6 then, the offsetting. So, could you just expand on this then, David, and how this works as part of Carbonology?
Yes, so by this point, you would have already reduced emissions by a significant amount, but whatever we do, whatever organisation we are, whatever you produce, make, sell, whatever services, your emissions will never truly go down to zero. So after this point, we need to then offset our emissions. So this is done via purchasing of carbon credits. So if you haven't heard of carbon credits before, they are essentially financial contributions towards a project that either directly sequesters and removes carbon from the atmosphere. So I'm sure you're all familiar with tree planting. So trees directly remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is also obviously very good. And then there's the other side of this, which is sort of lesser well known, whereas you can contribute to a project that prevents future emissions from occurring. So a lot of these happen in developing countries. There's thousands of projects all around the world, including providing people with more efficient stoves that are safer for them and better for the environment, supporting renewables projects. So there's solar projects, hydro, wind all around the world in developing countries that you can contribute to. Many of these can be literally bought as easy as going on online shopping website. It's literally as easy as going on Amazon and pressing a few buttons. But there are many suppliers, and it really is, as my colleague says to me, is a case of buyer beware, that you have to make sure they're from a reputable source, which many of them are, of course. But it is always worth purchasing offsetting credits from a reputable source that's been verified by a third party against high standards. So one of the ones I've been looking at a lot recently is the gold standard, which is all third-party verified. So that seems to be that is a very reliable standard with many projects on it all over the world that you can purchase credits for quite simply.
Yeah, and you're building up a portfolio of information on these credible offsetting organisations and schemes, aren't you, David, which will be available to anybody that's on that Carbonology roadmap and to share that information with them?
Yes.
Okay, great. So then, once they've got the evidence that they have actually done their offsetting, so the final step then is number 7, declare. So this is the stage when everything's been completed, but you want to have that badge of honour, and explain how this works then, David.
Yes, so this is where you produce your declaration of achievement of neutrality. So you can choose to have your carbon neutrality verified in different ways. So the first way would be a self-declaration. This is where you internally verify what you've done and put your own company name to it and internally decide we're happy with what we've done. But of course that would rely on stakeholders trusting what you've done, which I'm sure would be absolutely fine. But from an outside viewpoint, it gets more credible if you go up to a second party verification. So a company such as Blackmores, ourselves, we could go over the data and what you've produced and verify it for you. We're going up to the more generally accepted, more credible is the third-party declaration of verification. So this is where you would get a accredited certification body to go over what you've achieved and look into the data and then put their name to it. This, as I mentioned, is generally accepted as the most credible way to confidently demonstrate to your stakeholders that you have fulfilled the specifications of the standards. So there is definitely a trade-off between credibility and cost for these different options. There is the final part of that, which celebrating your success. So at Blackmores we have a client success media pack, which we can use to help spread the word of your success.
Cool. Oh, thanks very much for taking us through that in a lot more detail and explaining it much more clearly than I did in my initial overview. But yeah, so thanks very much, David, for your time. That's been brilliant.
Thank you, Mel.
Great. So, just to wrap up then, if you are looking for a sustainability roadmap, then obviously we are slightly biased, but we do think that Carbonology is a great way to be able to do that. And also, obviously, to demonstrate compliance with ISO 14064 for carbon verification and PAS 2060 for carbon neutrality. So if you want to get involved and find out a little bit more information about Carbonology, then David and myself will be more than happy to have a conversation with you about it and send you further information. In the meantime, we have got some information on our website, which is www.blackmoresuk.com. We've also got links in the show notes, and just a quick reminder so that you don't forget to join us again on the podcast. You can hit subscribe on the player that you prefer listening to, whether that's iTunes or Spotify. So if you subscribe, you're not going to miss any future episode, because we will be talking about how this is put into practice with some clients that we've been working with and their journey to carbon neutrality. So for now, I'd just like to say thanks so much for listening, and thanks once again to David for joining us. I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to achieve certification to an ISO standard or just need a helping hand with ISO compliance? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com.